My name is Balazs Arabik. I'm a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment and also a short-term expert at the Association for You project here in Kiev. It's really my privilege, and thanks for the organizers to having me as a moderator for this session. I truly believe that we do have an excellent setup, meaning we have perhaps the most experienced researcher on EU issues in Ukraine, Katarina Volchuk. We have a practitioner, Darius Žeruolis from Lithuania, who works in Ukraine on EU projects and other projects, assistance projects, ever since I know him, at least. We have Peter Wagner, the head of the support group for Ukraine, so we have the EU official view. And we have Anatoly Kutsevol, who is now the director of the reform support team at the Ministry of Ecology and Natural Resources. But previously he worked at GOI, so he have also long experience when it comes to EU integration policies and assistance in Ukraine. So we have a Ukrainian government official as well. The topic might be a bit too boring on paper, but I hope, and I can't guarantee, but I really hope that by the quality of the speakers, we're going to make it more interesting than on paper. I also do believe that this is the actual alpha and omega of all the implementation when it comes, as well as when it comes to one of the most curious and important case, which is the EU assistance, direct assistance to Ukraine regarding the association agreement implementation. So topics are going to be, according to the paper conditionality, how the aid assistance actually looks like, how it's implemented, how much money the EU spends in Ukraine, and what for, how the coordination going on, and also going through, a number of kind of inventions, just like the Ukrainian support group is one of the invention. It's very unique because it only exists for Ukraine, for example, vis-a-vis other countries. We will start with Katarina Volchuk from Chatham House. And I read it already a few weeks ago, but I reread it yesterday. There's an excellent paper Katarina and Darius wrote just a month ago, I think, a few weeks ago it was published, The Rebuilding Ukraine, an Assessment of EU Assistance. I wholeheartedly recommend it for you to read. It's an excellent background. It's also actually must have been a lot of work because there's a lot of data which I have never seen. For example, page number 9, there is a comparison of actual assistance to EU pre-accession countries, to Central and Eastern Europe, as well as to Ukraine. Gonna get to there. So, but what actually, which for me was very interesting is, it is describing how the EU step up the assistance to rebuild Ukrainian state institutions. So if you don't mind, Katerina, I will ask you about that, and obviously you're welcome to address the other points here in the topic. Thank you.
I think this works. Thank you very much. I do apologize in advance. I'm very Slavic and I tend to use my hands, so I may lose my voice as a result. I have to say this paper was a lot of work, and it was the collusion of minds with Darius. We come from totally backgrounds. Until 2 years ago, we never met each other. And when we started talking, we realized that we have a common agenda and common experience. And so this is something which has been on my mind for a long time and grew out of sort of perhaps curiosity. Why, despite so much assistance to Ukraine for a long time, we haven't seen the results which were achieved in other contexts, not least Central and Eastern European countries. So we've decided since 2014 to take stock what has changed in terms of change and continuity. And what is perhaps interesting, and it somewhat sort of echoes what very often EU officials say to our Ukrainian colleagues when it comes to getting the balance right. In terms of criticize, but also acknowledge what's good is happening. Don't just criticize. And now I really feel I'm at the risk doing exactly that. So much has happened, so many positive things, but there are certain aspects which we focus in the paper at length about the shortcomings, and I would like, to stress that this is one of the many aspects of EU's assistance, which in our view needs correction, perhaps even revamping, but it is one of the many aspects of the very complex package. And I have to say, with a particular sort of pleasure, I say in the UK, in the Brexit sort of context, what an incredible actor the EU has been vis-à-vis Ukraine since 2014, in terms of being dynamic, agile, and innovative. And those are not the words you very often hear about the EU, especially in the UK. So the number of innovations, and I think Peter is going to focus on them. I hope you are going to focus on them. Not least what is very often mentioned, the SGUA, the creation of the support group. But also what is apparent that the pattern of continuity and change is very interesting, and what we have quite a few paradoxes and idiosyncrasies. And perhaps that's the nature of EU's assistance. And I have to say, that was, I did my PhD on the constitutional process in Ukraine, which amounted to basically counting votes on the constitutional night in 1996 in Ukraine. And that was a formidable sort of, formidably complex process. And after working on this paper, I've realized that it's probably this process is more complex than my PhD. It is so complex, so multifaceted, that actually my view is that there are very few officials, and Peter is one of them, in the EU who actually understand sort of the assistance package as such. And from that point of view, we have to appreciate the incredibly complex within the EU institutions. It's just not devising assistance to Ukraine, but making sure that within the EU institutions that those ideas are supported and are implemented. And this sort of the double sort of burden or challenge that the EU officials sort of, it's squaring the circle, working with the EU institutions and delivering what is needed to the beneficiary countries. So this is the context, the broader context about the complexity, and I think this is the most perhaps important underlying message. But also what is apparent, and now I go back to the association agreement, and what we see, I think the fundamental issue with the association agreement is, and it has been recognized by the EU in its assistance, is the major paradox underpinning the association agreement, that the issues which the association agreement is supposed to address, weak state institutions, weak rule of law, economic misdevelopment, those are the very issues that hamper the implementation of the association agreement. So we have sort of this underlying paradox. And to the credit of the EU, but especially the officials working on this, the realization in 2014 that a new approach is needed. So the title of the paper is about rebuilding Ukraine. And we felt this sort of most important rebuilding of the state. And this is for the EU, and despite all our talk in the previous session, the Ukraine is nominally a third country. So the package which has been devised, it's very, very innovative and far-reaching by what actually the EU does usually outside the accession context, which means that de facto the boundaries between, we talk about the models, about integration, when we look about the EU role here, it's already de facto blurring the boundaries between accession and non-accession countries. So rebuilding of the state. But what it means in practice is that we have what I call the dual track in assistance to Ukraine. The dual track, one is actually working with state institutions, and that sort of more developmental type of assistance, and almost creating the preconditions for the implementation. And the second track is actually about technical assistance specifically devoted to the implementation of the association agreements. And one of the perhaps findings is that this juncture between those two tracks. But to be honest, I prefer to have those two tracks and this juncture between them than just have the narrow focus on the implementation agreement as such without creating the preconditions for the implementation. So this is the dual track. The problem is, and I think Taras Kaczka mentioned it, for example, that SGUA doesn't work on the association agreement and operationalizing it. And I think this is perhaps something which needs to be addressed, but we have to basically recognize what is being done in terms of rebuilding the state institutions. And what perhaps is the challenge, that the clock is ticking. The association agreement came into force, the clock is ticking, the deadlines, and this the most tangible aspect in the association agreement are those deadlines for different, in different annexes. And this that's the focus, and the sort of background work tends to be perhaps more important in a way, but also gets sort of more attention, and there are no particular specific deadlines, not least because they cannot be. Institution buildings takes years, and it's a iterative process of hit and miss, of adaptation, and of supporting the domestic actors in the reform process. That's what international experience tells us. So having sort of the deadlines in one part of the agreement versus working on the preconditions, that's almost sort of unavoidable. But we also know, as one negotiator of the association agreement said, that perhaps there were excessively optimistic assumptions what the countries are capable of implementing. And I think we can hide from this, or we can recognize and embrace this particular sort of conclusion as such, and I favor doing it in such a way that we don't actually undermine the association agreement, but we adopt a more realistic approach. And on this note, I will now focus on this, away from this state rebuilding track, which the SGUA has been working on, and more on the actual implementation of the association agreement, which is, from our experience, specifically when we look at particular aspects, supported by classic technical assistance. And from that point of view, this is where our major concerns are. Because at the micro level, we call it the macro level. So the state building track, that's the macro level in terms of coordination, in terms of sectoral approach, in terms of all the innovations and new modalities of supporting reforms in Ukraine. And the micro level is the technical assistance. And we've seen much of inertia there. A lot of sort of classic technical assistance. And I have colleagues one floor above me working on international development. And I've recently been to Moldova, and I've come across a project which is basically ticks every box how not to do technical assistance. And the jargon is, and I'm afraid there's a lot of jargon, it's about problem-driven iterative adaptation. It's about flexibility, it's about building close working relations and not bringing just best practice. You have to know, experts have to know best practice, but they cannot just bring solutions. They have to solve domestic problems. And from that point of view, that's what international development tells us. And yet, when we look at technical assistance, how it is designed, if we have an hour, Einstein said that if I have a problem, I spend 55 minutes on understanding the problem, and then I can solve it. He said, I spent 5 minutes on solving. We are not Einsteins, but at least understanding the problem. And that's my thing, that when it comes to the design phase of projects, there are generic templates, they are moving from the Western Balkans, they are not necessarily flexible, they are not necessarily adaptive, and they are focused on procedural compliance as such, because the procedures are watertight, and in a way for the right reasons. It's to prevent fraud, it's to prevent misuse of funds. But the flipback position is that they are the projects are designed on a too short basis, they are not sensitive enough to the beneficiary country's context. And I'll just give a very brief example if I have 2 minutes. I worked with a colleague who worked in a regional city in Ukraine. And he said he worked on an international project promoting devolution before 2014. He said 500 meters from the project office was the Golden Gates project, which offered basically to siphon off taxes from that regional city to Yanukovych and his extended family. The project was not aware. They were working on fiscal issues in the city, and they were not aware about this political practice, how effective they could have been. So this is sort of the most perhaps extreme example of assistance when the sort of actual political economy was not taken and informal practices was not taken into account. But how effective is that? I will mention that Moldovan project because perhaps it's the safest thing. An assistance project to the Moldovan parliament. 64 experts coming on 4-day missions. What do they understand about Moldova, about the parliament? And I realized, for me, that project was actually a drainage on the time of Moldovan parliament is understaffed, has not enough people, and having 64 experts coming on short-term missions means that those experts had to have multiple meetings to find out what was actually the situation in the country. And so perhaps that's one part of the coin. I will just focus on one issue as well, that there are often in the EU institutions unrealistic assumptions what EU technical assistance projects can deliver. And this is especially important when it comes to the operationalization of the association agreements. Which of the experts, EU sort of experts, has a good understanding of what is known as czynne ukraińskie zakonodawstwo, the current 93,000 legal acts. And from that point of view, actually devising, drafting laws, preparing legal solutions, and working with the association agreement, and devising basically a realistic strategy for the implementation of very sort of complex areas of the association agreements. My feeling is that many people in the European in DG say, oh, we have assistance projects, they can take care of that. De facto, those are vastly unrealistic expectations. So what perhaps the concluding comment is, when all international donors struggle with how to devise international assistance, but best practice is not to import best practice, basically. So in terms of actually saying how the EU tries to promote best practice by not lesson learning from international development as such. And this is important because it amplifies, because the importance of technical assistance as such, so the consequences are actually amplified because of the salience of this component as such. And hence, we offer a number of recommendations, and we hope somewhere a little sort of drop of water that this paper offers and provides some way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Katarina, for the excellent research. So external insights, but I found these findings, unfortunately and painfully true, in a lot of extent, particularly the lack of understanding of the local legal environment and all this. Let's move it to Darius, who, as I mentioned already, working here as an international expert in this local environment. So maybe you can address some of these findings as well from your perspective.
Thank you. In fact, I did this research, this and another research which I'm doing. I was commissioned by the Open Society Institute, its European integration arm in Brussels, also on improving of implementation of association agreements with Ukraine from home. So this year, it's my only second visit to Ukraine, and from this I perhaps should start my observations and my reflections of about 10 or 12 years engagement with Ukraine. So I would start with observing, it's noting that Ukraine, in terms of research and assessment, remains a country where the prevalent, unfortunately, I would add this unfortunately, where the prevalent method is ethnographic, meaning that without even some basic facts, you cannot figure out, without actually arriving at institutions and talking to people. So it's like in ethnography. You visit various people, you listen to their songs, their concerns, and then you pass a judgment. So if the membership perspective or membership stages of any standard, I would also can disclose one fact. I am also a country reporter for Bertelsmann Foundation, which runs this transition management index. For my own country, I am able to do a country report. Yes, well, I'm an insider to a certain extent as well, without a single call to an institution. So we have to somehow start narrowing, bridge this gap. And even in the previous panels, we heard, and rightly so, disappointment that the inferences about where countries stand or comparative progress is being made on a report, only on the reports from the European Commission, and it's very difficult to pass a credible judgment based on differences in semantics of how Commission is evaluating. So what I am arguing that serious analysis, serious research about Ukraine is missing, and I find it a little bit paradoxical. I'm not talking only about academic research, but also with all this assistance already in place and with its history. Unfortunately, very little of it is available in the public domain, and that is a source of big concern to me, because if it were available, it would be beneficial to everybody, and that would also would help create some pressure also for reforms. In certain cases, it would reassure member states, because I don't know how ministers of foreign affairs are passing their judgments. I understand it's from certain general impressions, but not to mention the fact that the data in this report, I hope you'll have a chance to see it, even the data on European Union assistance had to be assembled from 4 or 5 sources. I'm sorry, I think that's just not up to the standard that there is. And also you will notice I'm becoming very technical here, but perhaps you would appreciate the fact that there is a difference between levels of commitments and actual disbursement. I don't know whether there is anybody in this room who knows. We presented, and thanks to SGUA's work, the first and so far I understand the only report that they went back to 1991 and traced commitments. But does anyone know how much of that was really spent in Ukraine? I found only one source. That was an assessment of, I'm sorry, I have to say, we analyzed only in this data only grant assistance. We did not analyze loans which have to be repaid. So it's basically subsidies to Ukraine from EU budget. That's an important add-on qualification. So the only reference, the only assessment where it was done systematically was an assessment commissioned by DGNR, I understand, for 2002-2009 assistance, where I found that 65% were actually spent of the total money commitment. So from this, I took a liberty of generalizing that in 30 years, about at least 800 million euros were not spent on Ukraine, based on what was allocated. So first, beyond serious analysis, in addition to at least we have to get the facts right, and I didn't expect it to be so difficult. I mentioned 4 or 5 sources, and yet the data is not perfect. We understand that. Also, not to mention the issue of current and comparative prices. You know that the €1 today is not the same as it was in 1991. Right, and that should be well doable or relatively easy to do. My side observation would be that the best standard that ever existed in the European Commission was FARE up to 2000. So you would get allocations per country, you would get allocations, also actual disbursement, also areas, 12 or 13 policy areas, so you could actually track the development. Unfortunately, in 2000, also for the previous wave of enlargement, the European Commission stopped doing this, so it's not really even possible, more or less, exactly to tell where even the money went. So, point number one, more serious analysis is needed, and that's actually resonates to the implementation concerns that were raised in the previous panels today and the yesterday. So more serious and credible analysis we have about sectorial developments, the easier it will be to assess the chances of implementation, because now it's all legal approximation driven. Legal approximation is not the method. It's actually, you have to have a policy of what you actually want to do, and then only you accordingly change your legislation. But if you only change your legislation and don't do much in addition to it, it's a Potemkin village. And my general impression is that there are still a lot of Potemkin villages when you follow legal approximation as a method. Okay, so point number two, here I am, 10 years and 2 billion euros of EU's grant assistance to Ukraine spent in the period of 2005-2016, or sorry, it's allocation, so we don't know exactly how much was spent. And as Kasia rightly said, there are important innovations, so it's good that that European Commission wants a change and wants to improve, because 10 years ago my feeling was, being here in Kiev, EU assistance was just they wanted to have a flag attached, but they really didn't care much about what the projects were delivering. I mean, beyond the formal things which are needed for monitoring and evaluation missions and the auditors to tick off the boxes. So it's good. There are really important innovations and serious innovations, particularly in Ukraine. But overall, I would still, I mean, if I had to summarize in sort of one statement, my feeling is that still good projects and good programs, maybe with an exception of these delegated agreements implemented in certain policy areas, maybe we'll see how they perform, and that's one of the important evaluations which we praise in our paper. But the rest is good progress, or EU contribution to reforms happen by lucky coincidence of circumstances rather than by design or a plan. My general conclusion would be the same when I visit the projects and talk what contributed. So a lot of circumstantial coincidences, that, especially when we talk about really good projects. That's could and should change. We offer a number of recommendations about this. Now, in terms of, if I had to answer what was the most important change and investment, I would still argue, now to follow up on what I already commented yesterday, that investment in reform posts. That for a very long time we had this technical and twinning assistance being delivered to the same Ukrainian institutions, but if you don't have a relatively stable staff which is assured about its at least, I don't know, 5 to and more years perspective, so it ended up by assistance ended up being delivered to different ever new people, and then in many cases the same, actually, assistance. So this is the most important investment, I would argue, and I hope, and that's also in one of our recommendations, that it is sustained, because that's, and I understand European Commission is taking also its sort of credibility on it. It's an important innovation. But I would argue, even if it's sort of less successful than initial thought, that was an effort worth trying. Okay, and just to build up on and then to finish, because Balázs is already urging me to close. Couple of more recommendations that I would find most important. So this, we talked about it, or at least I talked about it during the first Association Exchange Forum, about this public depository of outputs or library of products. It's not happening, has not happened. I would even argue that things went worse in comparison to what we had in 2007, 2008 in Ukraine. Then, at least, all projects were required to have decent websites. Okay, many of them disappeared after the projects were closed. Nowadays, everybody's on Twitter. And except for EU for Business, which has a serious, and I understand a comprehensive coverage of their outputs, the rest are very, very few. So it's not even on the public domain, not to speak about the archive from what was actually provided from, let's say, 2005 or 8, and that creates a problem. And also, if we had those outputs, that I would argue that in the public domain, that would increase quality of assistance. So it would be people then would really be thinking more about what they're advising and what it is. So that's, transparency always creates different dynamics, and it's always to the better. We talked about the agency. I would argue must be continued and supported. Here I would only add, sorry Balázs, but I have to say this. It's also in the program, but sort of guidance training. 20 years ago, when I was going through this, and my colleagues here, in my 6 or 7 years, the only foreign trip I had to Warsaw in what was mainly a reassurance trip that we were actually doing certain things right. And here, it's lots of trainings, and it's what I'm worried it's becoming sometimes a substitution for work. So we have to see to it, and also European Commission, whoever is also devising assistance, training should come as a reward for work, not vice versa, not a precondition. A person with a degree from a Western university should be able to perform to a certain level. Yes, and I'm finishing on the last note. It was already discussed yesterday about focused agenda of legal approximation. I call it policy-led approach. That's certainly a legal approximation as a method is not a way to implement. And it's a little bit confusing when we're promoting this, of changing of the laws. And that's really the last point. We did a representative survey of Ukrainian officials. That's as a part of my research for Open Society Institute. It was also facilitated by the Governmental Office for European and Euro-Atlantic Integration here. So, I mean, I have now some quantitative estimates about, we asked people engaged in European integration here, officials from various institutions. So only about 20% said that they had a full set of sort of policy materials, strategies, roadmaps, cost-benefit assessment, finance, public finance assessment, down to very operational details. So only 20%. 50% said they had some elements of this. What is interesting, 10 to 15% say they what they are doing is not really connected to any of that. So 20% is 80% too close, and here I'm really stopped.
Thank you, Darius. You know, I'm a Hungarian, and the Hungarian Prime Minister was given 7 minutes in the European Parliament, so I have to be strict as well. Just kidding. But thank you for all the details. Right, it was too much, perhaps. Thanks for all the details. And now let's move to the Ukrainian perspective. Anatoly, perhaps not only from the ecology ministry viewpoint, but also as your previous experience at GOI, at the Government Office for European Integration. Let's focus on the national legislation, how the EU assistance could be done a better work. Also on, you know, state, the support for state institutions, how you think, you know, from your perspective that's going on, and obviously what do you think are also positive when it comes to the EU, I mean, the association agreement implementation.
Okay, good morning to everyone. So thank you so much for these first two speeches, really comprehensive, and I would say that I completely share all of them. And I also have my comments in general approach of coordination mechanism, not only in European integration, but in technical assistance, which also affects the system, and also this legal approximation process, which you're absolutely right, Darius, should be policy-led approximation process. And well, so I will start with two main points on coordination. It's mainly about technical assistance. We started to receive technical assistance as country from 1993, first agreements in 1992, and since that we have also chaos. I would say chaos because we tried to identify the one institution which will be responsible to coordinate all other ministries. But in fact, it doesn't work. What I mean? It works when you have political leaders. So when you have an area, for example, environment, and you have a minister who is capable and ready to discuss with donor community what he wants or she wants to do to deliver, and another example is acting head of Ministry of Health. When she knows what exactly she wants, she can ask donor community and explain how his or her policy agenda are linked to assistance and how they can absorb it. And here it comes to this word absorb. You have this good chapter in your report of capacity of line ministry to absorb. The problem is that when political level asks something, all donors are able to provide somehow. But when it comes to implementation, it goes down in the ministry, and it's about capacity of ordinary civil servants to absorb advice, legal acts, another practice, sometimes in another world. That's the main challenge which we have always, and we had it in the last 20 years, and I guess we will have so on. Hope only one thing will change it. It's public administration reform once really implemented. So talking about this coordination mechanism in European integration, I would say that Government Office is performing well as they have this action plan, and even EU has clear picture where assistance should be provided. But when it comes to the ministry, it's also policy-led approach. We cannot ask, for example, assistance in a waste management. I will tackle to environment. In waste management, like, please prepare for us a draft laws on batteries and accumulators and, for example, I don't know, an electronic equipment, for example. Okay, you ask, we will provide you a twinning project, you can do it, 2 years project, and then by the end, what you identify, you do not have a framework legislation. You don't have anything in place, so you cannot attach these two draft laws, which have been elaborated by the experts, to nothing in the Ukrainian legislation. What I mean? So also this responsibility and leadership should be not only from the level of the ministries, but sometimes from other side. Please provide us a clear picture of the policy, and then we will see where we can put this assistance. So in sense of this absorption in the ministries, the best practice which we have and currently with the projects is when we have the mix of EU experts or international experts and local experts. And I would say that short-term projects are useless. You said it previously. A lot of experts have to spend some time to understand realities and to tackle real challenges and problems which we have, and this is not written in TUR, unfortunately. And when they understand the problem, they do realize that it's not about their TUR. It's about changing somehow system. It's about communication activities and so on. And in case we are discussing the point, what should be done next stages after previous technical systems used, you mentioned 2 billion. It's a huge amount. The problem is of this institutional capacity and transferring results from one project to the ministry and to keep these results. In the EU, you have these preconditions to have for each project with this visibility component. Visibility component means you have to have these meetings, communication events and so on, but also to have a website. Sorry, but my advice would be please do not use your website. Use website of the ministry and publish all documents there. At least they will be kept there, and you have, once someone will be searching for something, they will open the website of the ministry. This works. And from the perspective of RST, I'm really happy that you have this mentioning in your report, which I'm currently representing. This is I would say this is a bridge between existing civil service and external experts. Those people who are local, who have some education, Western or Ukrainian, it doesn't matter how, but people who could understand international experts and to draft exactly what the ministry wants. And I would like to skip the point of asking international experts to draft any legal act. It's useless. Why? For example, in German realities, they do draft legal act according to their way to draft any legal act. So one word means a lot. In Ukrainian realities, it's more descriptive. In Germany, you have 15 pages. In Ukraine, you will have 90. So in all TURs, you should skip this. And the last point, which I would say about technical assistance, let's focus on more continuous. Like we have a project, APENA, it's a horizontal one from Ministry of Environment, and we are currently discussing APENA 2. I would prefer to have APENA 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, to tackle all horizontal issues in the area of environment, of reforms in environmental protection. But also the same one was in European integration also. There was one project which has been for a long time in Ukraine, helping for permanently, and currently we have association for you. Let's continue this practice. If not, we once again will fail, and people will change in the government. The government will change, ministers will change, politicians in the parliament will change, and nothing will happen. Last but not least, we are not discussing the problems of capacity in the parliament. Pat Cox's report is not implemented yet. We do not have good counterparts in the parliament. We should have someone who could create linkage between the parliamentarians, doesn't matter who, when, which session, and what, with the ministries. This will create a real normal agenda, like a handbook for new parliament. Please, this is for you. And this is European integration. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Anatoly. It was short, but very also insightful and very detailed when it comes to recommendations. And now last, but by no means least, Peter Wagner, the head of the support group for Ukraine. Before I give you a floor, 2 things. I remember when, as is long before you, joined the support group, and the support group was started only, or not even started, but was just actually formulating. I've been to Brussels, and I managed to talk to to become a member of the support group, and I was asking them, you know, like the big problem of Ukraine is investment, so what you gonna do about it? And the answer was, they looked at me and said, investment? Free trade will do it. I said, okay, that sounded a bit dogmatic. I think we moved from this. Thanks for this indeed unique innovation support group. We see direct budget support for a number of sectors, but I also seen your tweet today from the parliament when you said even the president now accepting that the reforms didn't trickle down, didn't bring the necessary social economic results. And I think the Moldova could be a very good case study how we can move very quickly from success story toward a fragile state, but also clearly social and economic difficulties, a situation where the social and economic conditions are having a huge political impact. So beyond focusing on these, sticks or more carrots are needed, how about the investment? What is the realistic potential for getting more money, and what are the obstacles for that? Thank you.
Thanks a lot for adding to the complexity of the many questions which were already in the earlier interventions, which in itself indeed is already a theme for half a day. My dilemma is multifold. On the one hand, I think on nearly everything that I want to say, I have to say there are better experts in the room, even if you said that I am one. I think on nearly everything that I think will come up and came up, there are people who know better. Secondly, we don't have a lot of time. Thirdly, if I would go now point by point through all the issues mentioned, and in addition the investments and the parliament, and I'm very sorry. At a certain moment I stopped taking note in that respect, because otherwise I would be at the end of the day very defensive, and I'm not. And that not in a personal sense, but in an institutional sense. Because what the EU has done in support of Ukraine since the Revolution of Dignity is without precedent. And with all these mumbling, criticizing personally, whatever, approach B, etc., going on, that's normal business. I think that should not be forgotten. As should not be forgotten, and that's maybe the issue with Twitter, the president also rightly quoted the international community, recognizing that since the Revolution of Dignity, this country has done more than the 20 years before. Now, I learned, inter alia, it's very important to have this right, you referred to it, the right balance between being positive, being negative. But I think it doesn't serve us at all if I go now into all the positive things, because I think this is indeed not what is today on the agenda, but it is too often forgotten. We yesterday had a discussion with parliamentarians, European parliamentarians and Ukrainian parliamentarians in the west of Ukraine, and there was also a bit of a mixed mood around certain developments. Then I said, yeah, but look at it, all this talk about pre-election, nothing is happening. Yesterday, Rada passed a law on extractive industries, which the country is in need of for 20-something years, for which I don't know. I myself talked about it to 3 in the short time I've been here, different finance ministers having tried to push it through, plus, it's not a mono, plus environmental ministers, etc. Now, the country continues changing, and even in Rada, you get through complicated laws. Now, what you're not getting through, and that's, of course, I also worked for a number of years before becoming an EU official as a researcher. They're not pushing things through in the way we like to describe them ex post with our limited access to archives, data, etc. So, long introduction, but I'd like to very briefly concentrate on 3 blocks, or not so briefly, that we'll see. You interrupt me when it's getting too long. Firstly, on all this data thing, it's a little bit linked to issues, and the history of it, yes, that is probably true, but we also have to understand the institutions, and that is every national budget, every national administration as well, etc. First of all, we are accountable vis-à-vis our budgetary authorities. And that is where programs are politically changed. We're now in a new discussion phase, and there are new brilliant ideas on the table. The next generation post-2020 is in Parliament and Council, and usually there, ideas are not streamlined. There are new things added up. Similarly, the financial management rules have changed. Another element, staffing in the institution has changed, and not for the better. We went through a significant period of cuts of annual 5-year reduction, and personally speaking, I am expecting post-Brexit, this will rather continue. Therefore, and with this general thing, as I'm fully aware, as I said, of these problems, and the frustration is I have here 4 different matrices in the way we try to present our budget, and we're not going back to 2000 whatever, we're just talking about the last 4 or 5 years, because every person has another approach. I was traveling in the country with the Budget Control Committee. Their approach, what they want to see, how they want to see it, completely different from yesterday with a group of parliamentarians. They have certain regional investments, what is happening here, what is going there. Talking to we had the summit recently where overnight we had to do an additional one because the Commission President, as a former finance minister and Prime Minister, but as a finance minister, has a certain way of looking at data, etc. And you each time do the matrix in a different way. And it's not, I am also bad with numbers, but it's also because of that I stay away from this big announcement and we spent this and we spent that. I think if we talk about it post-Maidan, 200 million a year in grants. Now, first thing to come in is, I have to add complexity, there's the whole macro-financial assistance in addition, which are not grants, but which are, if you talk about the reforms of a country, an absolute precondition. Because otherwise, if you don't get into the stability, which one was fortunately quite rapidly, also with the IMF and the enormous reforms in the country, able to achieve, all the rest wouldn't be worth anything. So that's also why it's so important that these things stay on track. And we have an honorable member of the European Parliament around, it is not getting any easier for the EU institutions, the Commission, to propose additional macro-financial assistance. And these are loans. These are not grants. So we stop it there. We now have to see. RADA has to, it has been signed. RADA has to ratify. And then I really hope one has been trying to work on the quality of conditionalities, etc., that they are ambitious but achievable, that the overall objectives can be achieved. Now from this leads me to this question of what is it that we want to achieve? Do we want to be efficient? Now, there are two possibilities from the discussions which we had here, and in the presence of cameras and the member of the parliament, I don't even dare mentioning them, but the first one is we take the annual budget, do one single budget support measure out of it, attach 10 conditionalities to it, assess a year later where we stand, and transfer the money or not. Now, on budget support to Ukraine, there was an evaluation about 18 months ago. If you look, and that is the issue of commitments and payments, and that was a starting point for me because it's different from maybe the perception we sometimes try to analyze and reflect on why we think about certain changes. Ukraine gets around 40–50% out of the budget support. In other words, all the money is, after a number of years, what we call decommitted and goes back to member states. Not even the EU budget as such or anything, it goes back to member states' budget. Fine, they love it. They really love it. And it's not an Ukraine external relation specific dimension. I've seen the similar approach in internal policies where I spent most of my career. So that's why we consciously decided to reduce the number of budget supports, because we had quite a huge number. It was the biggest part of the EU commitments, in the interest of Ukraine, also after discussions with Ukrainians. Because what's the use of transferring money to the budget if it's only half of what could be made available in other circumstances? Second simple solution as well, and by the way, for such an approach, I could immediately dissolve the support group and the biggest part of the operational section of the EU delegation, because you just need a few people for policy dialogue, following up on a number of conditions. Second approach, and you referred to it, is we put all the monies to international financial intermediaries. 3 big commitments, well, a bit more than, but let's say the EBRD, the EIB, and then we have some national ones which are very active here, like NEFCO from the Nordics, KfW, a little bit the Council of Europe Bank. We do our one contract with each of them, with a certain number of you do the investments. Here as well, the similar solution, we wouldn't need the delegation operational section at all, and again in Brussels as well, 2 or 3 desk officers managing contracts with IFIs. All the rest is an issue of auditors and evaluators following up. That's efficient, maybe. Now, what we tried to do was, in addition to efficiency in the terms of management, to introduce, after very painful discussions which we had with previous current government, and you observed from different positions some of them, that one thought let's go together into, I'm not sure it's not innovations because the thing existed. Maybe are we applying them in a wider sense, in a more comprehensive sense, and are also presenting them sometimes differently. I haven't changed any implementation rule or whatever with the people, but we're trying to do things differently. And what are we trying to do? That is, we are accepting that, and that's what you referred very rightly so to, that the problems of this country cannot be solved in the normal program cycle of 3 years. Now, I underlined this country because it's a normal development, including our own member states. Brief parenthesis, we have something similar to the support group in the member states, where all the experience with the support group, Cyprus support group, Portugal, Task Force Greece, etc., was merged 4 years ago into a so-called structural reform support service, which is addressing exactly these issues. And if you start looking, maybe in 3 years' time there's enough evidence and researchers really could find some interesting issues there. What do you see? Member states seem to struggle with a similar challenges with which the association countries are struggling. The biggest number of projects there is in the area of public administration reform. Now, it is not always a complete overhaul of the public administration, but even Germany, I understand, now I hadn't time to double check what I heard on the phone, has asked for support, guidance, this kind of best practice in the positive sense, on how to restructure in light of the latest versions of the EU acquis, the legislative situation, etc., certain of their national agencies, Bundesämter. And that is what is happening. So it's not a unique situation, and this is not Ukraine being the pariah. This is part of a big picture that we're having everywhere. Now, what we try to do there is to subject, or depending on what is the area and the analysis, address it in different ways. Because behind what you say, delegated acts, etc., which are modes, there are quite different approaches. If we take, and now without going too much into details, if we take the decentralization project, there's no budget support component in it. It's a component where for the first time we roll out, with EU money, via some national agencies, a regional network, which is made up of Ukrainian experts. A lot of expertise, of course, coming also in, but the majority of the investment goes into support very concretely given by Ukrainians to Ukrainians at the local level. Different public administration reform. It's very clear such a reform costs money at the beginning. Therefore, we took, after 2 years break and reflection phase, a bit, let's call it, risk of going back to budget support to some degree. But budget support that is very clearly linked to very strong technical assistance. It's linked to a very heavy, big technical assistance project, because only then one can jointly tackle all the issues. And again, part of it is out of philosophy, reform positions, reform support teams, all these kind of efforts. And that is what I think is, and even that is not an innovation, but maybe we have been trying to do it on a larger scale, bringing new people, fresh blood, fresh ideas into the institutions. And not only bringing them from abroad somehow close to the institutions, but bringing them with the changes in the public administration directly into the organization. And as one of you called it, a bridge, with the reform support teams, have Ukrainians who are close to it in a kind of a consultancy role, but they're Ukrainians, we are building capacity. That is something that I think we are trying to concentrate on. Now, the problem is, and if you go through the issues, we are, for example, also at the moment very concretely discussing with RADA how one indeed could now continue this support into the into RADA. And if I say this support, it means a lot of support because these things are linked. You mentioned projects which are happening with the government office, which are kind of pure traditional technical assistance. We also have other projects which are public administration reform, because also in RADA these things have to happen. And you have a number of issues. And you of course also have, and that's, I'm finishing on this, part of what the EU colleagues, because as is GUA, we are just a kind of a reinforcement of what exists for every country. It's just more showing the importance that the EU gives to to Ukraine. It's just comparatively more, and thus we can have more impact. If you look at what the ambassador is doing in the country, or has been doing the last 2 years in setting up internally new structures, but also in moderating that the institutions work together. And for the first time, we have an action plan. This is something that 3 years ago, when we started talking. There is now a joint action plan. Now we know that there's still, on the operational side, issues that can be addressed. But that's what I always say when I last year was at this event. Yes, statistically, the performance is not terribly good if you just tick boxes and count numbers. But if you look at the qualitative improvement in the country on the institutional side, what has been put in place, there's a lot, there are many reasons for hope. And let me just see whether there was any quite particular issue on what I still wanted to react, but no, I think I'll leave it there and leave also time for some interactions. It is a little bit to wrap up. I said I showed you 2 very efficient solutions, and then we close down all the rest. Or we take jointly the risk of trying for different areas, different new approaches. Try being then also criticized by vested interests, and vested interests are not only oligarchs. There are many people who would prefer continuing on an internationally paid consultancy contract rather than entering into the administration at what is the normal level or even the reform position salary. Or we try, and I think it was in one of the papers, we accept the risk of partial failure, because not everything will work out. It's maybe not the normal approach for public administration and in the European context where we're a bit risk averse. But if one jointly agrees on that, I'm optimistic. As I said, what has happened on the EU side as support, on the Ukrainian side with the changes and with what is by now in place, I think the future can be bright. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Peter. I think the previous critical remarks get the best out of you because it was really comprehensive addressing. And also, I think it's very important to reminding the actual context also of European politics, but also the macro level. We calculated, for example, that since Maidan, the EU mobilized really up to 15 billion euro for Ukraine, which, just a reminder, Vladimir Putin also put $15 billion before the Maidan on the table. So it's not really a small amount, but these are the technical issues like the absorption capacity, which needs to be focused on more. And the second quick remark is that we often, that's the how to manage expectations, because we often forget that this is not the EU running the country. This is still Ukraine, independent, sovereign, and we can assist. It's not, we can't take responsibility for a lot of things. And this is a bit of the EU analytical think tank bubble, which I'm part of, so I'm kind of can take responsibility for it. And sorry about that. Okay, now we have almost 30 minutes for questions. I think it was a very substantive, I want to collect, remarks, so I want to collect a few questions and then go back to the speakers. Gentleman here, please introduce yourself.
Ramonas Vilpišauskas, Vilnius University. Thank you for interesting comments. My question is about the role of IMF as, not just an sort of anchor of disbursing financial assistance, that it acts together with the European Commission and other institutions, but I would like to hear your assessment. What are the synergies between the work that IMF is doing here, often together with the World Bank, and EU assistance? Because we are together actually with Darius and Katarina in the same Horizon project on Eastern Partnership country reforms. I read, I think, all IMF reports since early 90s regarding Ukraine. There is so much information about failed reforms, and they have such an impressive institutional memory, I think, that And of course, I know that there are regular contacts, meetings between IMF people and European Commission, but still, would be very interested in your assessment how this expertise is being used, or is it mostly bad cop and good cop? IMF being bad cop, of course.
Thank you. Right there.
Peter Havlik from Vienna. In fact, I have a very similar question as my Finnish colleague earlier said. Apart from the EU as
Lithuanian, but that's almost.
Sorry.
It's very
sorry.
close.
Okay. I'm sorry. Okay. So apart from the EU, IMF is very important, and besides that, there is also a lot of bilateral assistance. And I would like to know whether there are some coordinations, whether there is some added value, or just these different national and international experts are coming to the ministries' offices and so on, and do their work.
Thank you. I think both questions, these are for Peter Wagner. Obviously others can address, but let's get one more.
Hello, my name is Denis Chanush, Expert Group Chisinau. I have a question and a remark. So the question is about the Court of Audit's conclusions on the implementation of European projects in Moldova. And I remember that they were saying clearly that apart from budgetary support and other kind of assistance, that European Union should revise in order to make it more efficiently used in Moldova. It was also something explicitly mentioned regarding the high-level advising mission. And I remember myself talking with some people working with those representing this, let's say, this mission of advisors. And it was the understanding was kind of wrong. From the side of Moldovan officials, because they are waiting for the European advisors to come with ideas, while the European advisors are waiting for the Moldovan officials actually to say where to help and with what. So there is really a kind of a watch and wait, and I think that this wrong approach should be really changed. And maybe my question is, if you have analyzed and if you are using the reports of Court of Audits in your work, research work, and the remark was about the success story. If I'm not wrong, the European Union is always looking for success stories, and right now I think that Georgia is somehow used as a kind of success story, and I think that this is again another wrong approach that European Union should change, because I see a lot of similarities between Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia. In particular, when we speak about vested interests, more exactly oligarchs taking control over state institutions and oligarchization of political power. Thank you.
Thank you, Denis. So 3 questions. I would suggest then, obviously, the star is Peter Wagner, so he start, and whoever wants to add, please do so.
Thanks for the Moldovan question, because finally, because at the end I realized we've all been talking, I have notably been talking about Ukraine, but somehow was pushed into that direction. And also to be clear from the beginning, I have the luxury to be in the Commission the only director who only has to deal with one country. Some of my colleagues have up to 40. Now, I won't say that they're all jealous, but sometimes that is easier. But that shows, again, the importance that the EU pays to this country. Now, on the questions, IMF, synergies, etc. Yes, I think you can see a lot how we are coordinating. We are coordinating very closely on the conditionalities, which does not always mean that we have to agree from the beginning, but once they have been set, we at least make sure that they are coherent. I think in Ukraine that works pretty well. It's not always worked everywhere. That secondly, we work here as well, much more than in other cases I'm aware of, jointly on the implementation. Now, there's in addition one thing, that we have a kind of even legal cross-interdependence, meaning macro-financial assistance depends on, as does budget support, depends on IMF programs being on track. Now, the only ones who are completely independent or large of the IMF. There we are all jealous. But also the World Bank depends on the IMF program being on track, etc. And where I said we work very closely is, if we talk now public finance management as just one area, we as EU, having more budget on this grant and TA side, help the IMF financially and the World Bank financially to take charge of areas where they have expertise. Because I'm deeply convinced that the international institutions, but also then some member states organizations, have, for different reasons, different kinds of expertise. And that is what we are trying to mobilize and bring into the country. I think it works. That's a bit the transition to this question on the national bilateral programs. I think it works pretty well if we as EU, together with Ukrainians, articulate early on where our big attention will go, because that allows the member states then to also put their resources there. And if we take decentralization, is a program in which financially Germany, Denmark, and for the first time Poland, with national Polish funds paying into the EU budget for us implementing a program. We bring them in a really new way there together by having announced it sufficiently early. And then we have Sweden, Estonia, very concretely in the program, in the so-called ULEAD, that's the official name, context working. So that's the EU component in narrow sense. But what is also happening then on this coordination is you have, I think, 26, 27 coordination groups here on the ground, depending on the policy areas. In the implementation then, and if we come to decentralization, they have agreed on a completely aligned intervention logic. The whole matrix, who does what, is aligned as you will not see it in too many other countries. It's relatively close to the theory, which doesn't work everywhere. So I think also there, in addition to this, what I would call the strategic upstream communication, and that's why we are in Brussels twice a year talking to member states about the ideas. I'm traveling to capitals. Finland, for example, is coming in at the moment with activities in the education sector. We had already under preparation vocational education and training, and we're trying to mutually reinforce that in the current political context, also by now strengthening, using this expertise on particular support for preparation of education for minorities. So there are certain things where you then, in this kind of bilateral EU approach, get synergies. Having said this, I'm not naive. In a country as big as and important as Ukraine, many other countries have national interests. And I'm the last one who would even try to pretend that I can stop each and every country. At the end of the day, firstly, they all need back at home, and then we're into the budgetary logic again, the visibility, their flag themselves. Secondly, and there's not only the EU countries, some have more of an interest in the energy areas, others have more an interest in the agriculture, etc., etc. I think the key is, and that's again now what we try with the IMF, at least there should never be any contradictions, competing objectives and competing programs. So I think there is a lot going on, but, and there was a reference to it, of course it would be much easier if the country had one big national development strategy, translated into regional development strategies, coordinated by a central entity and then articulated into the thing, and not, I don't know how many, and I refrain from even trying to count them, different ministries and institutions send their different letters to different parts of donors, and only within the EU I have a bit of an overview. We try to ensure coordination, but I also admit very often it's ex post rationalization of what we are trying to do. I think I cannot say a lot on the specific project of the advisors, but it was a project at which we looked very much when we were about to design at the time public administration reform and a few other projects in Ukraine. I cannot judge, knowing not all the details of the situation in Moldova, whether it would have been better, but we thought at the time it's not the kind of approach that in Ukraine is needed. Partly for the reasons which you mentioned, because we think the ideas are there. Public administration reform, there is a kind of an OECD standard on it, with the Sigma principles, etc. so the big strategic questions are theoretically answered, and one now has to build consensus in the country on how to implement it and help there. And for that, you don't need a big group of strategic advisors. This is kind of why I said situation to situation, you have to adapt. It was a test, and I would not exclude that there could be areas in Ukraine, reform areas, where we might again seriously look at such an approach, because I think if proactively done and if translated in what you described at these kind of intercultural challenges of both sides waiting for the others to say what they want, also not unique, maybe one could do it better. And I also fully agree, by the way, this issue of how you call it success stories, I call it the front runners. In 4 years, the Eastern Partnership discussions had 3 different front runners. I'm one of the oldest in the room. I'm sure I'll see others still to come.
Thank you. Anyone else? Darius?
Yeah, just a couple of things. Regarding bilateral assistance, in fact, and we state this in the paper, it's in the Annex 2, EU member states, when it comes to grants, are more important contributors to Ukraine than EU institutions. So out of the total, all grant assistance that Ukraine is receiving, about EU and EU institutions and member states make up about 54%, and the EU institutions alone 26, if I'm not mistaken. So it's double. EU member states bring in double of what European Commission or EU is providing. Now, but you also are right, yes, this issue of coordination will not be solved until Ukraine is strong enough to guide it. Let's face it, but I don't see much of a tragedy here. But I would like to come back to at least, and maybe, I don't know whether it's possible, I tried to investigate this a couple of years ago, again, at least better information sharing. Sorry, going back to this publicly available library, at least the products that could be more shared. We actually, if you read the paper carefully, we bring one example from the area of European integration coordination, where the Brits spent 1 million euros 10 years ago to support establishment of a predecessor of GOI under the Vice Prime Minister Grigori Nemire, where all possible models and practices were researched. Very high quality output. 10 years ago, it's gone, it's not even used. And now I'm reading that these models are being researched by outside consultants once again. So I'm sorry, I have nothing to say. So here I think there could be some progress made by European Commission and member states alone. Yes, they will want all the flags attached, they have all the interest, and that's fine. I mean, that's life. But to be more transparent when it comes to the products, I hope it's possible and feasible. And sorry, Peter, I just wanted to comment on, I fully appreciate the concern about various reporting matrices and accounting matrices. That it's, I mean, just creates an additional burden if the Parliament wants one way of reporting, member states another way of reporting the beneficiaries. But still, it is possible. I'm sorry I could not really get my hands on the CRIS system, it's Common Relics Information System. It's on the project level. So from when you have this lowest possible unit of measurement, you can aggregate, but I'm not sure it's being used properly. So it is possible to also to accumulate it up to the areas where European Union is actually spending, and in terms of allocate. Well, maybe that would be disbursements only, but still would be if European Commission was reporting on it, and that. As far as I'm concerned, that should be part of the annual report about how much the countries, each of the DCFTA countries are receiving, and at the moment it is not.
Thank you. Just very quickly, since I was engaged into donor coordination since 2006 from the American side, I have to highlight how big achievement, what Peter Wagner was mentioned, the bilateral versus EU and one or a few flagship project. I think it's great, it's fantastic, and it's, as far as I see, is working well. A second on the IMF, 7 out of 7 IMF program went on track. Off track. We can blame Ukraine only, but I don't think that's the case. I think the IMF has a very dogmatic approach, and that also has to do something with that these programs are going off track. Maybe the issue is like, you know, the deeper analysis, and the IMF has fantastic analysis. The issue is what the approaches are actually fits to the current Ukrainian reality or not. So just, I would actually love to see a comparative analysis about these 7 IMF programs in the past 20 years. It would be a wonderful research project if anyone wants to do it. Economist, obviously. Any other questions? Any other questions? Oh, there you go.
Well, thank you very much, Petros Auštrevičius. I'm a member of the European Parliament, ALDE Group. I wish I saw more members of European Parliament here. I mean, not really to believe that there is only one line in the EU budget. I mean, like assistance, and it works as a magic thing in all instances in all countries. My question, I mean, to two excellent experts on EU assistance. I mean, did you register any regret in those institutions who failed, I mean, to absorb more than 40, 50, or 60%? I mean, is there any, I mean, kind of negative feeling among those officials in charge or probably managing, I mean, those funds? What kind of the intake, I mean, you would probably report? In Ukraine, for example, as you have the most recent study made. And Peter, I appreciate, I mean, more conditionality, more smart conditionality and reasonable conditionality we impose. Later we might talk about this. What kind of the, again, feedback you could see in Ukraine? Well, I mean, we had some quarrels. I mean, to what extent to impose that conditionality? Is that reasonable? I mean, this roundwood issue and so on and so forth. But was any kind of reaction from the wide public in Ukraine? I mean, they should know. I mean, we demand, I mean, we request, I mean, the Ukrainian institutions to perform and to deliver. What do you comment on this? Thank you.
If I may, we did not ask about any regrets, but for a reason. I don't think that there are many officials around whom we can trace back to 2005 or so. But there is one important recommendation, and I would draw your attention. And this is, I think, also creates a little bit of a handicap. We call it an ethos of never-ending support. Our situation was different. I mean, ours, when we were acceding to the European Union, we knew its support would be a one-off opportunity. So it was a sprint. It's basically 5-6 years of preparations where you could hope at best to receive one technical assistance project. And there were many institutions which actually acceded to the EU without any support. Here I also have a feeling, and then getting back to your question whether there is any regret, I would dare say that there is no regret. I mean, I'm not even talking about those 40 or 50% unabsorbed. I'm talking about the implementation of current projects. That efficiency is actually much lower because I understand it's in the mindset. So what? I mean, we can always design and whatever was the project number 2. Anatoly, I'm not pointing to you, but that's yes. So we will continue receiving, and that's I don't know how to solve it, but that's clearly my feeling is that's clearly a problem. Instead of actually getting most of what is available, maybe it's also, I don't know what is the thinking on the European Commission side. I know that Ukraine has to be supported, but whether it has to be supported at any cost, that's a big question.
Great. Kasia?
Thank you. Can I come back on this issue of the IMF? And it's indeed one of the most tricky, we talk about the problems in Ukraine. The international community has a problem as well. And in a way, Ukraine is a perverse success story because being flooded with international assistance since 2014. And in a way, Georgia was there. And I was struck really by a Georgian official who said by 2008, the Georgian government was thinking about refusing international assistance projects. And I could see why. I had the sort of pleasure of traveling from Tbilisi to Sukhumi with a Georgian expert and a Lithuanian expert. And I was developing schizophrenia, because the Georgian expert was trained in the common law system and was talking about American-style judicial reform, and the Lithuanian colleague was talking about legal harmonization with the acquis. And at the end of it, you thought, gosh, we're talking about two different models being implemented. What we see now is that basically European integration and the acquis is the main, if not the only game in town. And that's already a success story. That from Switzerland to the USID, they do accept, and there is sort of this understanding that we cannot do sort of shopping for different models, not least because then national officials and experts are already much better informed than they were in the 1990s. With the partial exception of Moldova, and I think Moldova is a very interesting example of basically being donor-driven reforms and donors bringing and driving the agenda to the point of incoherence. And the national government struggling, and what we have, for example, as one expert counted, up to 200 plans for reforms, from sectoral to ministries. With so small administration and the government we have, how can you actually have reforms? It's a miracle that things are implemented nevertheless. But coming just to this sort of international coordination, the issue is, and there are no easy answers, it's about it's called, I'm sorry, I'm an academic here, multi-issue conditionality. When you have 12 conditions and you all list them, and it's a single disbursement, how do you weigh different conditions, especially in the challenging geopolitical context? And I'm afraid Ukraine for a long time cherished this notion that we are too important to fail. And paradoxically, since 2014, this has really, the dreams came true, because Ukraine is regarded as too important to fail. And the issue is of also shopping for, because Ukraine is flooded, there is this competition between different donors. So coordination here is vital, that the same conditions or the same preconditions are spelled out by different donors. But there is no doubt that IMF has a very convenient role of the bad cop. And there were people queuing to talk to the IMF to insert their conditions. It's an unprecedented demand that domestic actors were actually asking the IMF, please look at our sector and include that condition in your conditionality. But there are no sort of easy answer in terms of multi-issue conditionality, and IMF is its own victim. It was far too lenient in the past. It socialized the Ukrainian governments. Whatever we do, we'll still get the money. So it's now unlearning, but it goes sort of in cycles. And perhaps just a very quick coming back on Moldova, because I think Moldova is extremely interesting. And their advisors, I would just come back. This is a classic example of high-level advisors who are not even allowed to take photos with the prime minister because they are supposed to be technical experts. But they are high-level advisors and they cannot have a political role. How do you drive the reforms without having a political role as such? And this wait-and-see policy, who is doing what, is very much, so despite having that institution, it has, in my view, underperformed, despite the best effort of individual advisors. And Moldova is also, we touched on legal harmonization as not a recipe. And Moldova is a fascinating example of being a success story of easy legal harmonization. Cut and paste from Romanian language, draft laws, and legal harmonization is one of the most difficult aspects. And as people on legal transplants, lawyers, will say, laws are not electric appliances. You cannot unplug it in Germany and bring it and plug it in Ukraine. And from that point of view, Moldova is a victim of having too ready access without without reflecting of what problems those laws are going to serve and what problems they are going to address and how do they fit into the bigger reform process as such. And from that point of view, it's really sort of a cautious tale because this problem-oriented approach, and I have to say perhaps the final, it's like a therapeutic session. When I hear from the EU officials that Moldova we are going to deliver the benefits of the people directly by passing the public sort of, or state administration, I'm slightly concerned. What is the EU going to do? Build roads, kindergartens, schools?
They are doing this, actually.
Yes, that sounds very good, but ultimately without, unfortunately, states may be, public administrations may be imperfect, but there is no way of bypassing them in terms of actually long-term development. So I agree, political conditionality when it's needed vis-à-vis the political elites, but not at the expense of penalizing actually the reformers within the Moldovan structures. And that's my, perhaps plea for more calibration.
Thank you.
I propose a half-day seminar on budget support with me as a moderator, and you bring from our side our new head of cooperation here in Kiev, who's been working before for 3 years, 3.5 years with me in Brussels, and we had these discussions, and he's done it in many countries on budget support. And just to summarize some, in addition to the evaluation which is available, it comes also to the conditionality question. The amounts available, you said we have several of them. Now we had, because we're really phasing them out. Who in this country, with all the wealth around, maybe not properly distributed, but all the wealth around, feels an incentive or a threat from a budget support program of 80 million, which is already high, let's say 50, which then average was, over 4 years? What's the threat? First big challenge. Secondly, they have this duration. You negotiate with government A. Here you sometimes even have a revolution in between. And you disburse on the basis of the earlier agreed conditions. That's where we lack the flexibility which the IMF has in its much more political, even if they don't admit this word, assessment of the situations. We have, you know it from macro-financial assistance, a very strict legal view. We agreed with Parliament and Council the following issues, and then we go ahead. But that's another challenge which we have in this duration of budget support programs. Then you have, therefore, also the issue of these kind of technical conditions linked to it. You cannot get a public political debate. And I spare the other half-day seminar about the media landscape in this country. But do we really want to have it? How can you have this debate about how much should we analyze e-declarations? Now, having had them was another issue. But a certain moment you enter into a level of granularity which don't offer itself for this kind of public debate. And I think all this combination is the challenge. And then comes one, you asked the question to the colleagues here, but that's the key issue in budget support EU style. It's, if we call it a sectoral support program, we do it with the energy ministry. And of course, it's very much them together with RADA and others, etc., to deliver. But the EU contribution goes to the general budget. And as I said, in addition, you have maybe the third minister since the signature. Where's the leverage in that situation? So that's what we have to keep in mind, and that's why I said the amounts and all of that in Ukraine, it's really different in other countries. We have to very carefully think about how you do it. And then a final comment on this, the level of it and what we are doing. Maybe because I try to be short, it was not obvious, but if I said 200 million, the 200 million are a political number. The kind of general allocation to the country, and even that Parliament and Council agree on every year, is lower. It's around 140 million per year. So there is already a bonus in, which is linked to how President Juncker summarizes it. As long as you reform at an extraordinary level, we continue supporting at an extraordinary level. We think the country is still reforming. That's why we think the 200 are justified, but it's no automatic approach to it. And this non-automatic approach to it, you will see that the discussions have started in Parliament and Council. In the future legal base, this kind of conditionality of having maybe a lower starting point and having then higher flexible elements, the importance of that is increasing. So I think politically one has the intention, but really very fine remark, don't expect someone like a poor commission director to decide whether, as you put it, Ukraine is worth the continuation of support or not. Because politically speaking, I think for me it's very clear. I have political mandate to do whatever is in my mandate and has to be done to support the ongoing reforms.
I was talking about supporting the same things over and over. Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you so much. I also suggest, on my capacity, to sign up for the budget support seminar. Also, all the European experts who are writing about EU assistance, I'm happy to volunteer myself. Thank you so much. Please, yeah.
Yeah, if you allow me. So, thank you so much for this comments on continuation of the project. I was talking about that in 2 years' time, it's not possible to tackle all horizontal issues. That is why you are not supporting the same issues, but you are supporting different aspects of the overall structure which has been done in the first year. But I would like to refer to one question about regrets. What kind of regrets do you have once the end of the project is coming? The only one, that you haven't spent time properly at the beginning of the project and you didn't use properly the technical assistance. And this is the end. And you do not have continuation, and you will not have a lot of other time to get advice. That's one of the biggest regret. Those probably a lot of civil servants do not regret about technical assistance project at all, but regret about time, how they used it. So only one question about coordination. And talking from practice, we have good relationships, different ministries, they have different relationships with EU member states, and there is a donor coordination meeting in the EU delegation at least one time a month, and they are discussing total priorities. But when it comes to one area specific, the key issue is who will be on behalf of donor community, not only EU, but who from one member state will be coordinating all donors. It's not up to the ministry to coordinate all donors, but to speak the same language. So, for example, we have Sweden. They are talking to other donors and explaining what is going on and trying to push them to allocate more money for some specific areas. And absolutely right, EU member states are contributing much more than EU. In our case also, for example, Germans are contributing 30 million euro for technical assistance. For 3 years' time, it's not the same amount for EU. That, I would say, is a general comment, so we receive more for EU member states than EU. Thank you.
Thank you. Without a further ado, just my one kind of conclusion or concluding remark. It seems like historical and institutional memory needs to be strengthened a lot, because history may be not repeating itself, but the Western assistance to Ukraine challenges are kind of keep circling around. Thank you. Please give a big applause for the excellent panelists. They really deserve it. And I enjoy your lunch. Thank you.